Jump in here. This was the news today. All right, so picking up where we left off last time, we were talking about Nebuchadnezzar and the Neo-Babylonian period in which Babylon rises to ascendancy and really picks up the pieces of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, except really for the eastern parts, which go to the Medes. We'll talk about the Medes next time, and also to the west. This period of transition after the death of Ashurbanipal and the taking of power by Nabopolassar and then eventually Nebuchadnezzar, of course, right, creates a power vacuum like we've seen over and over and over again. And Jerusalem, with the aid of Egypt, goes into open rebellion in 597 BCE. Nebuchadnezzar responds to this rebellion by sending an army. He actually ends up conquering Jerusalem at this time, doing what Assyrian kings couldn't do, right? We saw Sennacherib earlier, an Assyrian king who tried to take Jerusalem and was unable to. Hence, right, he sacked Lachish instead and immortalized it in those reliefs at Nineveh. Well, Nebuchadnezzar was actually able to take Jerusalem, and he deports the Judean king on the throne there, a king named Joachim, and many of the citizens of Jerusalem, carts them off, and installs Joachim's brother, a king named Zedekiah of Judah, on the throne. This doesn't work out so well. The Neo-Babylonians are having the same problem that the Assyrians encountered in administering an empire so large. And even Zedekiah, who supposedly was supposed to be loyal to these Neo-Babylonian kings, loyal to Nebuchadnezzar II, he actually ends up rebelling as well. So in 587, or 586 thereabouts, we see a second campaign of Nebuchadnezzar II leading from Babylon all the way to Jerusalem. And this time, he means business. This time, there's no, sacking the temple and just making off with the goodies and going back to Babylon and installing a new king. No, this time Nebuchadnezzar actually ends up destroying the temple altogether. And this is a pivotal point in Near Eastern history, and also plays a very large role in modern Jewish identity. This is the period known as the Babylonian exile, 586 to 538, where Nebuchadnezzar II not only completely destroys the temple in Jerusalem, but carts off the population and brings them to Babylon, following that Assyrian tradition of deportation as a way to destabilize a power base. And certainly it's very effective. They're actually able to return in 538 under Cyrus the Great. We'll talk about Cyrus a little bit later in the week. But obviously this major deportation in 586, in fact there's another deportation that takes place. Jerusalem causes problems again in 582. So there are actually three different periods in which the citizens of Jerusalem, of Judea, are carted off and taken to Babylon and relocated by the Neo-Babylonian rulers, by Nebuchadnezzar II. So obviously this gives them a very bad reputation in the Bible. They're not seen as being particularly nice people for obvious reasons. And that sort of influences Western opinion of the Babylonians, just like the Philistines, right? We even use Philistine as a way of saying a heathen or somebody who's not cultured. But right, we saw that the Philistines were actually quite cultured in their own way. In the same sense, Babylon, things Babylonian, the Whore of Babylon, these kinds of things, are rooted in this tradition. And we're going to look at the origins of that tradition a little bit today. To do that, I want to rewind a little bit. I want to go back to the end of the Late Bronze Age. So if you remember, that's around 1200 and the beginning of the Iron Age around 1000 BCE. Right, and this is at the same time, right, we see all of these shifts taking place along the eastern Mediterranean coast. This is contemporary with the arrival of our Philistines, our sea peoples that are sacking the coastline. And at this time, we see the emergence of a new group of people who we mentioned in passing. I wanted to come back to them. And these are the Israelites. Now, this is a very tricky question archaeologically. both in terms of the evidence and in terms of the politics of Israelite identity, because obviously, these origins have ties to people that have very, strong ties through Judaism in the way that modern Jews see themselves and their history. And we'll get into that in just a moment. We do have, of course, a number of texts that refer to the Israelites, the Bible being the primary source, the Old Testament. And what we're told is that from around 1000 to 930 BCE, we see the emergence of a united monarchy of the kingdoms of Israel and Judah under two kings, King David and King Solomon. This time is disputed. There's a major debate about what actually archaeologically is linked to this period, this very short period, again, of about 70 years, 1000 to 930 BCE, in which this united monarchy took hold. We do have some evidence, though, however, some of the earliest coming from Egyptian sources. This is a stele from the king Mereneptah. Of course, we're familiar with Mereneptah, late Bronze Age ruler who campaigns into Canaan, into modern Israel and Jordan. And in one of his reliefs, he actually ends up giving us a clue as to who these early Israelites are. And I'll read you the passage in question. That's pretty interesting. Typical Egyptian victory stele. Mereneptah is proclaiming his deeds. And he states, "The princes are prostrate saying peace. Not one of them raises his head among the 9 bows." And the 9 bows is a way of referring to the 9 different enemies of Egypt. "Now that Libya has come to ruin, Hatti, the Hittites, is pacified, and Canaan has been plundered into every kind of woe." And he starts naming cities. "Ashkelon has been overcome. Gezer has been captured. Yaoam is non-existent." And then he mentions this very strange and unknown group, which Flinders Petrie, who discovered this stele, translated as, so you have Y, and then Si, Ri, Er. So Yisrael. And of course, right, that sounds a lot like Israel. What's even more interesting is the fact that in Egyptian, this is late Egyptian, but even in Middle Egyptian, when you write a word, often you use what's called a determinative at the end of it. This is, a non-phonetic complement. It's just a sign to designate what kind of word you're talking about. So, if you're talking about, for example, an action that is to strike, you'd actually maybe have an image of a man striking, in addition to the phonetics of the word. So, Yisrael. In the previous mention of these cities like Ashkelon, Gezer, Yanoam, the determinative is a city. And as you can see here, the determinative in this case is not a city, but it is a people. So this fits very, very well with the biblical account of these tribes of Israel who don't have cities, who are moving, are semi-nomadic, trying to settle themselves in the region. So this is kind of one of those points at which we say, aha, okay, maybe there's a bit of extra biblical evidence for this. Some of the kingdoms of the early Iron Age, as we've seen, we'll come back to some of these, Shechem, Megiddo, and Hatzor. We've talked about Ayan Dara. We'll go back to Ayan Dara in a moment. So the biblical account of the origin of Israelite kingship, we read about it in Samuel in the Old Testament. According to the Bible, the people desire a king, and so God directs Samuel to anoint Saul as a prince over Israel. So Saul is the first king of Israel. Saul and his sons are killed in a battle with the Philistines, who are, again, traditional enemies of the Israelites in the Bible. And he's succeeded by David, this enigmatic figure, the same David, of course, right, that kills a Philistine by the name of Goliath, right, in the famous story of David and Goliath. Goliath is a Philistine from Gath. David's considered to be the first great king of the Jews and establishes his capital here in Jerusalem. He's portrayed as a warrior and a unifier, and his son Solomon by the reign of Solomon, who dies in 928 BCE, really represents a high point in this period of the United Monarchy. Solomon was said to have been a builder. In fact, he's kind of revered by modern Freemasons as being sort of the archetypal builder, building the temple in Jerusalem, controlling large areas of land and engaging in extensive trade networks. In fact, in this painting by Pointner, you can see he's greeting the Queen of Sheba, right, who's coming all the way from Yemen to meet with him and cement all sorts of relationships. Now, again, these are biblical texts. These are coming from later biblical texts. And the actual archaeology is a bit more complicated. For example, we're told in depth about the temple that Solomon created, this temple to the Hebrew god Yahweh. And the temple is central to Judaism. It's the resting place of the divine presence. It's where Yahweh dictated that the divine presence should be located. Also, traditionally, this is the location where the universe began. This is where God separated out light and darkness, according to the Torah. Also, the temple serves a political, religious, and economic function in society. And all sorts of things. It's actually where the dust was collected to create Adam, all sorts of things. So very, very important location. But it's a location that's unknown. We don't actually have archaeological evidence per se of the Temple of Solomon. And that's for a number of reasons. The temple is thought to be here in modern Jerusalem, underneath what's known as the Haram al-Sharif, or the Noble Sanctuary. Often it's referred to as the Dome of the Rock or the Temple Mount, right? So this would be the Temple Mount, the location that the temple was built on. Calling it the Dome of the Rock or the Temple Mount is very political, right? It depends on how you look at this site and what period of history you are putting the most emphasis on, because what we're looking at is one of the most currently contested religious sites in the world. It's sacred not just to the Jews because of its proximity to this temple, the Temple of Solomon, and a later temple during the time of Herod, but also it's the third holiest site in Islam. This is the site of Muhammad's night journey, where he actually travels to heaven and back, alighting from a rock which is encased by this beautiful structure, the Dome of the Rock, this iconic image from Jerusalem. So just to give you a sense of the rundown of this particular complex, it's a very complicated history. The temple, again, as we know, is destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar in 586 BC. It's rebuilt by Zerubbabel in 516 BC, after the Jews' return, and glorified by Herod during the Roman period. The Romans, putting down Jewish revolts, decide to destroy the second temple now in 70 CE. And the site pretty much lays bare, and it's reused in different ways until 692 CE. And that's the point at which the area is sanctified, and you see the construction of the dome and also the Al-Aqsa Mosque, to, again, venerate this very holy site in Islam of Muhammad's night journey. The Western Wall, which some of you may be very familiar with, is part of this Herodian complex dating to that second temple. It's possible that Herod, in building this large